Welcome to Moonlight Audiobook. I'm Julian, your host, and today we've got something intriguing and mysterious lined up for you. Today's mystery is the gentleman in the portrait. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a twist or turn. And as always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's see how far our mystery-loving community goes. Now, let's dive into today's mystery. Chapter 1. It was a crisp autumn evening when Hercule Poirot received the peculiar letter that would set him on the path to a most unusual case. The envelope was of fine cream paper, the script on the front elegant and flowing. It was from the esteemed Lady Eleanor Carrington, a widow of considerable wealth, known for her lavish gatherings and impeccable taste. She had invited him to stay at her sprawling estate, the Carrington House, located just outside London. The occasion? A private art exhibit featuring her most recent acquisition, a mysterious portrait that had sent ripples through the art world. The letter spoke of a rare and valuable piece, one that had once belonged to a noble family from Venice, whose name had long since faded into obscurity. The artist, too, was unknown, as the work had remained hidden in a private collection for centuries. Lady Carrington, ever the connoisseur of rare things, had purchased it for a sum that caused even the wealthiest art dealers to raise an eyebrow. Of course, Lady Carrington's letter concluded, there has been a small incident. Nothing to cause alarm, but I do hope you will be able to lend your expertise. I believe there is more to this portrait than meets the eye. Intrigued, Poirot had no intention of turning down an invitation from such an influential lady. His mind, ever curious and sharp, instantly went to the words incident and more than meets the eye. There was something, he was sure, that lurked beneath the surface. His little grey cells were already buzzing with possibilities. The following morning, Poirot, meticulously dressed in his signature suit and bow tie, boarded a train to Carrington House, where the mysterious portrait awaited him. The journey was uneventful, though Poirot's mind could not help but wander back to the letter's cryptic words. What was this incident that Lady Carrington referred to, and why had she felt the need to contact him? Upon his arrival, Poirot was greeted with the warmth of a grand entrance hall adorned with exquisite tapestries and towering marble columns. Lady Carrington, a tall, regal woman in her early 60s with sharp features and an air of authority, was waiting at the foot of the grand staircase. Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of excitement and, it seemed to Poirot, something more, perhaps anxiety. Mon cher Poirot, she greeted him with a gracious smile, her voice as smooth as velvet. I am so glad you could make it. It is, indeed, an honor. The portrait is here, waiting for you. But, I must warn you, it is no ordinary painting. Poirot bowed slightly in acknowledgement, his eyes taking in the grandeur of the surroundings. Madam, I have no doubt that it is indeed extraordinary. But it is the mystery that intrigues me more than the artistry, if I may say so. Come, she said, gesturing for him to follow her through the expansive corridors. I will show you the portrait. But I must also warn you, there have been odd occurrences, strange noises, unsettling feelings among the guests. Some even claim that the portrait is cursed. Poirot raised an eyebrow but said nothing, allowing Lady Carrington to lead him further into the house. They finally reached a room at the end of a long hallway, its door slightly ajar. Inside, under the soft glow of an ornate chandelier, the portrait stood, larger than life, and yet somehow imposing. The subject of the painting was a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a dark velvet suit, his face pale and stern. His eyes, impossibly lifelike, seemed to follow anyone who entered the room. The title beneath the portrait read simply, The Gentleman in the Portrait. Do you see? Lady Carrington asked, her voice a whisper now. There is something about him, isn't there? Something that does not sit right. Poirot studied the painting carefully, his sharp eyes noting every detail. The composition, the brushwork, the artist's intent, everything seemed immaculate. And yet, there was something that escaped his mind, something unsettling about the man's expression. The gaze, Poirot muttered to himself, more to focus his thoughts than to speak aloud. He looks aware. No, not merely aware, alive. It is as though he is watching, waiting. Lady Carrington nodded eagerly, her face filled with a mix of awe and fear. Exactly. That's what I felt the moment I saw it. But that is not all. The staff, they refuse to go near it. They say the room feels colder when they are alone with it. And the guests, well, some of them are beginning to feel a sense of unease. Poirot turned back to the portrait, his eyes narrowing. Madam, there is one thing that I must say. A painting, no matter how lifelike, cannot possess power over a person unless something has been set in motion. But perhaps it is not the painting itself that causes the unease, it is what lies behind it. Lady Carrington looked at him with wide eyes. What do you mean? Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but that is for me to discover, madam. You have invited me to uncover the mystery behind this portrait, and I shall. But first, I must meet the other guests, the people who might hold the key to this incident you mentioned. With a nod, Lady Carrington agreed, leading Poirot out of the room. As they made their way to the drawing room, Poirot's mind worked rapidly. There was indeed something wrong with this picture, but it was not the painting itself. He could sense the undercurrents of fear, the tension in the air. Whoever had created this work, whether artist or owner, had ensured that it would be more than a mere piece of art. It had become a symbol, a harbinger of something darker. The game was afoot. Chapter 2. The drawing room was filled with soft murmurs and polite laughter as Poirot entered. Lady Carrington introduced him to her guests, each one more enigmatic than the last. The room, though opulent, seemed oddly tense, as if the very air was thick with hidden secrets. First, there was Sir Reginald Weatherby, a man in his 50s with a receding hairline and a sharply tailored suit. He was a collector of rare antiques and a well-known figure in London society. His demeanor was that of someone used to being listened to, yet his eyes darted nervously around the room as though something, perhaps the portrait itself, unsettled him. Poirot gave Sir Reginald a courteous nod, but it was Lady Carrington who spoke first. Ah, Sir Reginald, do tell Poirot about your recent travels to Venice. I believe it was there you first heard about the portrait. Sir Reginald hesitated, his lips tightening. Indeed, Madam Carrington, but it was hardly an affair of note, he said with forced nonchalance. I merely passed through a private estate where I saw the portrait in question. It was for sale, though I knew little of its provenance at the time. Poirot observed him carefully, noting the slight tremor in Sir Reginald's voice. A rare find, no doubt, monsieur, he replied, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. But I am curious, why would someone like you, a collector of such fine pieces, remain so vague about its history? Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably but avoided answering directly, giving Poirot a tight smile. Well, the past is always a shadow, Monsieur Poirot. I am not one to dwell on it. Next, Lady Carrington introduced him to Miss Eliza Davenport, a young woman in her late 20s with striking auburn hair and an air of aloof elegance. Her sharp green eyes followed Poirot's every move with calculated curiosity. She was the niece of one of Lady Carrington's closest friends, and her presence in the house seemed to be of little consequence, until one looked more closely at the way she held herself. A quiet intensity radiated from her, suggesting that Miss Davenport had a far deeper knowledge of the world than her social standing would imply. Miss Davenport, Poirot greeted her, his eyes quickly studying her delicate features. "I trust you find the Carrington house to your liking." She smiled softly, but her gaze never wavered. "It is charming, Monsieur Poirot. Lady Carrington has exquisite taste, after all." She paused, as though carefully weighing her next words. "But I must admit, I find the portrait rather unnerving. It is as though it looks straight through you." "Ah, yes," Poirot replied. "It is that very gaze that seems to unsettle so many." He studied her intently. "You, too, have felt this sensation, I presume." Miss Davenport smiled, but there was something cold behind her eyes. "I have, but then again, I tend to be rather sensitive to such things." Poirot made a mental note of her response, but before he could probe further, the door opened to reveal the last of the guests, a man in his 40s, tall and imposing, with a face weathered by experience and a manner that could only be described as authoritative. This was Colonel Edward Hawthorne, a former military officer with a reputation for quick decisions and an even quicker temper. "Ah, Colonel Hawthorne," Lady Carrington said with a note of warmth in her voice. "So glad you could join us. This is Monsieur Hercule Poirot, the detective I spoke of." Poirot bowed slightly, his gaze lingering on the man's stiff posture. "Colonel," Poirot greeted, offering a polite handshake. "I trust the journey was to your satisfaction." Hawthorne gave a curt nod. "It was adequate," he replied, his voice deep and gravelly. "But I do not care for mysteries, Poirot. I prefer things straightforward and clear." "I understand," Poirot said, his eyes glinting with quiet amusement. "Though, I suspect, monsieur, that life does not always offer us the clarity we desire." Hawthorne gave a short laugh, his gaze flicking briefly to the portrait. "Perhaps not. But in this case, I think the answer is simple. We have a cursed painting, and if people are afraid of it, they should leave. It's nothing more than superstition." Poirot studied the colonel's strong features, noting the hardness in his eyes. "Ah, so you believe the painting is merely a product of imagination, monsieur?" Colonel Hawthorne shrugged. "It is a painting. Nothing more." As the last of the introductions were made, Poirot took a moment to assess the dynamics of the group. Each of them, it seemed, held some fragment of the truth, yet each of them was hiding something. Lady Carrington had mentioned an incident with the portrait, but her guests seemed intent on brushing it off, each one offering a different perspective on the matter. Poirot's mind raced as he silently observed them. Sir Reginald was clearly holding something back. His reluctance to discuss the painting's history raised a red flag. Miss Davenport's aloofness, though charming, could be a shield for something more. And Colonel Hawthorne's blunt dismissal of the entire situation seemed to stem from something deeper, perhaps a desire to maintain control. The tension in the room was palpable, and Poirot could almost taste the unease that lingered in the air. There was something more at play here than just a simple portrait. He could feel it in his bones. After a few moments, Lady Carrington clapped her hands together, bringing everyone's attention back to the matter at hand. "Now, Monsieur Poirot, perhaps you would like to begin your investigation? I am certain you have questions for us all." Poirot nodded, his eyes never leaving the portrait. "Indeed, madam. But before I begin my questions, I must first take a moment to examine the portrait more closely. There is something about it that calls for my attention, something that is not immediately apparent." With that, Poirot made his way toward the painting, his sharp mind already piecing together the clues, the contradictions, and the motives hidden beneath the surface of each guest's carefully crafted persona. This was just the beginning. Chapter 3. Poirot stood in front of the portrait, his gaze fixed intently on the painted figure of the man. The room around him seemed to grow quieter, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for Poirot's next move. His sharp eyes scrutinized every inch of the canvas, the meticulous brushwork, the interplay of light and shadow, the gaze of the subject, which seemed to pierce through him. Yet, despite the portrait's undeniable skill, there was an unmistakable tension in the room, as though the painting held a secret that none of them could yet uncover. Lady Carrington, standing at the far end of the room, watched him closely. She shifted nervously, but Poirot paid her no attention. His mind was already working, calculating, observing the subtle dynamics of the guests. He could sense their unease, their impatience. They were waiting for him to speak, to make sense of the portrait's unsettling presence. But Poirot knew that this mystery was more than a matter of mere superstition. "Ah, yes," he murmured to himself, stepping closer to the canvas. "The eyes. They follow you, yes. But this is not what troubles you, is it?" His fingers gently brushed against the frame, and Poirot noticed something. A slight imperfection at the corner of the painting, almost too subtle to detect. It was a faint, almost invisible scratch on the wood. He ran his finger over it, as though testing it, and then he stepped back. There was nothing extraordinary about the scratch, yet it seemed significant in some inexplicable way. "Tell me, madam," Poirot said, his voice sharp with focus. "When did you acquire this portrait?" Lady Carrington, who had been standing at the side, answered quickly. "I purchased it just a few weeks ago, Monsieur Poirot, from a dealer in Venice. I told you, it was a rare find." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And before this, where had it been? Who owned it?" Lady Carrington hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "The dealer said it came from a noble family, but he didn't elaborate on who. Perhaps someone from the past, an aristocrat who was no longer in the public eye." "Interesting," Poirot said, his tone measured. "So you have no further information on the painting's history? No written records?" Lady Carrington frowned. "None that I could find. It seemed to have been kept hidden for a long time." Poirot nodded, his thoughts racing. There was something in Lady Carrington's answer that did not quite add up. It wasn't just the lack of records, it was her discomfort when discussing the portrait's past. He glanced around the room, his gaze flicking to each of the guests. They, too, seemed oddly tense, as though waiting for something to happen. "Perhaps it is not the painting itself that is the cause of the disturbances," Poirot mused aloud. "Perhaps it is the unknown history of it, the mystery that shrouds its past." At that moment, Sir Reginald Weatherby, who had been standing in a corner of the room with a glass of brandy in his hand, stepped forward. "I beg your pardon, Poirot," he said with a forced smile. "But this all seems rather fanciful, don't you think? A mere painting, and you're acting as if it's the source of some great crime. I believe we've all been entertained by the notion, but I hardly think we need to indulge it further." Poirot turned slowly to face him. "Ah, monsieur, but you see, it is not the painting alone that concerns me. It is what it represents, the things it conceals. There are always contradictions, even in the most innocent of things." Sir Reginald scoffed lightly. "Contradictions? Surely you don't believe that every piece of art is hiding something sinister. The world is not a place for mystery novels." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Indeed, but sometimes, monsieur, the world is far more complex than it appears. And sometimes, the simplest of things can conceal the greatest of secrets." With a curt nod, Sir Reginald returned to his place by the window, clearly unimpressed by Poirot's deduction. Yet Poirot could sense that Sir Reginald's dismissive attitude was a mask, one that concealed something deeper. There was no mistaking it now. Sir Reginald was hiding something. Perhaps his reluctance to discuss the portrait's origins was not mere disinterest. Perhaps there was more to the story than he was letting on. Poirot's eyes moved from Sir Reginald to Miss Davenport, who had been observing the exchange with a carefully neutral expression. Her lips were pursed, and her gaze shifted from the painting to Poirot, but there was no hint of fear or unease in her demeanor. Just cool observation. "And you, mademoiselle," Poirot said, turning his attention to her, "what is your opinion of this portrait?" Miss Davenport tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I told you earlier, Monsieur Poirot, I find it unnerving. But that is all. I don't believe in curses or ghosts. It is simply an unsettling piece of art." Poirot studied her for a moment. She was the most composed of the group, but there was something in the way she spoke, something guarded, as though she were carefully choosing her words. "I see," he said. "A simple piece of art. No more, no less." But Poirot was not so easily convinced. He had learned long ago that those who proclaimed their indifference were often the ones who hid the deepest feelings. There was something Miss Davenport was not sharing, something she was concealing beneath her cool exterior. As Poirot continued to study the guests, he was interrupted by a loud crash from the hallway. Everyone in the room froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Lady Carrington's face turned pale, and Miss Davenport's eyes widened in shock. Without a word, Poirot swiftly moved toward the door, his every step purposeful. The others followed suit, but it was clear from their hesitant movements that they were not as calm as Poirot. They reached the hallway, and there, lying on the floor in a crumpled heap, was Colonel Hawthorne. His face was contorted in pain, and his eyes were wide open, staring unseeing at the ceiling. The large brass candlestick that had once stood on the nearby table now lay shattered beside him. "Mon Dieu!" Lady Carrington gasped. "What has happened?" Poirot knelt beside the colonel, quickly assessing the situation. It was clear that he had been struck by the candlestick. Its jagged edges were covered in blood. The colonel's body was still warm, but he was not breathing. An accident. Poirot mused aloud, his voice laced with skepticism. Or something else. This changes everything. The atmosphere in the house had shifted from uneasy to outright tense. The guests were now visibly shaken, their faces pale with fear and confusion. Poirot's mind, however, was already working, piecing together the puzzle. The crash had not been an accident, not a mere coincidence. Someone had deliberately caused it. The first false lead had been set in motion. The incident with the colonel was no accident. Of that, Poirot was certain. The question now was it connected to the portrait, or was it a distraction? An attempt to cover something else up? "Mon Dieu," Lady Carrington whispered again, her voice trembling. "What is going on here, Poirot? First, the portrait, now this." Poirot turned to her with a calm yet unwavering gaze. "Madam, I believe the answer is hidden in plain sight. But we must proceed carefully. There is more to this story than you or I have yet uncovered." And so, with the colonel's unexpected demise, Poirot's investigation took a darker turn, one that promised to reveal far more than anyone could have anticipated. Chapter 4. The body of Colonel Hawthorne was quickly removed from the hallway, the blooded candlestick and shattered pieces of brass still lying in a disturbing pattern on the floor. The house was once again silent, the guests now scattered, murmuring among themselves in shocked disbelief. Poirot, however, remained unfazed, his mind already shifting gears as he processed the new development. Lady Carrington had been beside herself, her face pale and tear-streaked as she clung to her most trusted servants for reassurance. Her personal distress seemed to outweigh the gravity of the situation, but Poirot had learned long ago to ignore the theatrics of the distressed and focus instead on the subtleties of their reactions. There was more at play here than the colonel's tragic demise. "Mon Dieu," she had whispered several times as the colonel's body was carted away, the echo of her distress still lingering in the air. Poirot, standing amidst the murmur of the remaining guests, surveyed the situation with his usual calm precision. As the authorities arrived, Lady Carrington explained in halting sentences that the colonel had been examining the hallway when he had stumbled and fallen against the candlestick, which had somehow hit him with deadly force. Poirot remained silent, his small but discerning eyes scanning the room. His thoughts were sharp, pulling apart the layers of the scene as he considered each possibility. Had the colonel truly been struck by accident? Or was this an orchestrated move? A perfectly timed distraction? One of the first things Poirot had learned in his long career as a detective was that human behavior was far more telling than physical evidence. The painting had unnerved Lady Carrington, no doubt, but her reaction now suggested something more, something deeper. Was her distress real? Or was it part of a more calculated display of vulnerability? He turned to the remaining guests, Sir Reginald, Miss Davenport, and the staff. Sir Reginald was once again in the corner, far away from the action, his drink now half empty. His body language suggested discomfort, but not the kind that came from genuine shock. He was too calm. Miss Davenport, on the other hand, remained unusually composed, her eyes flicking back and forth between the body and Poirot, almost as if she were weighing something. Her calm demeanor was too controlled for someone in the midst of a death in the house. There was no visible panic, no sign of concern that one would expect from a woman of her age witnessing such an event. It was clear to Poirot that she knew something important. Poirot addressed Lady Carrington calmly. "Madam, you are distressed, of course, but tell me, did the colonel have any enemies in the house? Did he say anything unusual before his fall?" Lady Carrington, still shaken but pulling herself together, wiped her eyes and gave a subtle shake of her head. "Enemies? Not that I know of, Monsieur Poirot. He was well liked by everyone, as far as I could tell. He was here to enjoy the evening, not to cause trouble." Poirot's lips curled in a slight smile. "Ah, but not everyone shows their true intentions. You may not have seen it, but I have, perhaps a different side to him, yes." The lady paused, clearly struggling with her thoughts, but Poirot was already turning his attention to the others. He had already seen enough. He had watched Sir Reginald's eyes shift toward the colonel's body as it was removed, but more telling was the barely perceptible shift in his posture when the scene had unfolded. It was the movement of someone who had been momentarily caught off guard, but not frightened. Poirot made a mental note. Sir Reginald had not been panicked. He had expected something like this. Turning back toward Miss Davenport, Poirot addressed her directly. "Mademoiselle, what do you make of all this? The colonel's untimely death, the painting. It seems to me that this is all connected. But how, I wonder?" She gave him a cool glance, one that seemed to brush off his question. "I do not know, Monsieur Poirot, but I would be more concerned about the rumors surrounding that painting. It's just a painting, after all, but it seems to have caused much trouble." Poirot tilted his head, observing her carefully. "A painting, yes. But you see, mademoiselle, this painting is no ordinary piece of art. It holds secrets. I have already seen enough to know that. And I know that the colonel's death is no mere accident. There is something more here, something dark, hidden beneath the surface." Miss Davenport's eyes flicked away for a split second, but it was enough for Poirot to catch. It was a fleeting moment, but it was a clue. She was hiding something, and it had nothing to do with the colonel's accident, nor the painting's supposed curse. Poirot's mind raced through the possibilities. The colonel's body had been found in the hallway, right under the portrait. And that had been no coincidence. In all his years of solving mysteries, Poirot had learned one thing above all. There were no coincidences. Every movement, every gesture, Every word spoken was a piece of a larger puzzle. And as he looked around the room, he realized the significance of the moment. The Colonel's death had not been an accident. It had been planned. And the psychological game had already begun. Poirot leaned closer to Miss Davenport, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tell me, mademoiselle, do you know why Colonel Hawthorne was really here? Or what he knew about the painting?" Her eyes narrowed. "What are you implying, Poirot?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I am not implying anything, mademoiselle. I am simply trying to understand the pieces of this puzzle. Perhaps you could assist me in solving it." Miss Davenport remained silent, her jaw clenched in defiance. But Poirot was not discouraged. He had seen this reaction before, a subtle, carefully constructed wall of defense. "Very well," Poirot said, standing tall. "I shall get to the bottom of this, mark my words. But I believe you are hiding something, mademoiselle. And I will find out what it is." With that, Poirot stepped back, his mind already spinning with the possibilities. He had gathered enough to know that the Colonel's death was just the beginning. There was a much larger story unfolding here, one that involved the portrait, the guests, and perhaps even Lady Carrington herself. The psychological game was afoot, and Poirot had every intention of playing it to the fullest. As he turned to leave the room, Lady Carrington's voice stopped him. "Monsieur Poirot, what do you think happened to Colonel Hawthorne? Was it murder?" Poirot paused at the door, his back still turned. "Madam, I believe that this is just the beginning. The truth is hidden somewhere in this house, and it is my job to find it. But I do not yet know if it is murder, or something else entirely." And with that, Poirot left the room, the guests now uncertain of what to expect next. The game had truly begun. Chapter 5. The atmosphere at Carrington House had shifted dramatically after the Colonel's untimely death. The guests, though shaken, were still wrapped in the web of mystery that Poirot was so keen to unravel. There was no longer any question that the death was an accident. It had been deliberate, calculated. The Colonel had known something significant. The question was, what had he uncovered that led to his demise? Poirot, however, was not one to act rashly. His mind worked methodically, like a clockmaker disassembling and reassembling a watch, looking for the smallest gears that had caused the malfunction. He had already interviewed Lady Carrington, Sir Reginald, and Miss Davenport. All of them had told their version of events, but none of them had fully convinced him. The portrait, the gentleman in the portrait, loomed over the proceedings, an ever-present symbol of the mystery that lay ahead. And Poirot knew that there was something in its history, something in the way it had come to Lady Carrington's collection, that held the key to this tangled web. But how to connect it all? That evening, Poirot decided to take a closer look at the portrait. He was alone in the room, the faint light of a single lamp casting long shadows against the walls. The guests had retired to their chambers for the night, leaving Poirot to ponder the scene in solitude. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he stood before the painting once more, his eyes scanning it with an intensity that could have pierced the canvas itself. What was it about this portrait? The man depicted seemed frozen in time, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark pools of mystery. Every time Poirot looked at him, he felt as though the subject was trying to communicate something the artist had hidden in plain sight. But what? Poirot's gaze traveled down the painting, and for the first time, he noticed something that had eluded him before. At the bottom of the canvas, barely visible beneath the frame, was a small inscription. It was so faint that only the most meticulous observer would have noticed it, and even Poirot had almost missed it. The writing was in Italian, a language Poirot spoke fluently. L'uomo che non muore mai. The man who never dies. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. The inscription was a message, a clue, if ever there was one. But what did it mean? Why had it been placed there? And who was the man who never dies? As Poirot stood there, absorbed in his thoughts, a soft creak echoed through the room. He turned sharply, his instincts immediately on alert. His sharp eyes scanned the shadows, and to his surprise, he saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was Miss Davenport. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of something that suggested she had been watching him for some time. Poirot's gaze lingered on her for a moment, before he addressed her. "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot said softly. "I did not expect company. But perhaps you have come to admire the painting as well." Miss Davenport took a few steps into the room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "I thought you might be here, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice cool. "I wanted to speak with you." Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Speak with me? About what, mademoiselle?" She paused, then stepped closer to the painting. Her eyes locked onto the portrait, and for a moment, Poirot could almost see the weight of the secret she was carrying. "About the painting, of course," she replied. "There are things you do not know. Things you should know, if you are to understand the truth." Poirot's mind immediately sharpened. "And you, mademoiselle, believe you know the truth?" Miss Davenport's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no humor in it. "I believe I know some of the truth. Perhaps more than you think." Poirot watched her carefully, his mind racing. Was she trying to mislead him, or was she finally ready to reveal what she had been hiding? The tension in the air was palpable, and Poirot knew that this moment could be the turning point in the investigation. "Then," Poirot said, his voice smooth and composed, "perhaps you will enlighten me. What is it that I do not know?" For a long moment, Miss Davenport said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Do you really think it is just a painting, Poirot?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the portrait. "Do you think it is merely a piece of art? Or could it be something much more?" Poirot remained silent, his gaze fixed on the painting as well. He could feel the weight of her words, the weight of the unsaid things that hung between them. There was a hidden truth here, something that connected the portrait, the Colonel's death, and the guests who had gathered in the house. "It is not just a painting," Poirot replied, his voice quiet but firm. "No, mademoiselle, it is something far more dangerous. But what, exactly, I am still working to uncover." At this, Miss Davenport's demeanor shifted. She stepped back, as if she had said more than she intended. "I should go," she said suddenly, her voice more guarded now. "I am sorry for disturbing you, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot watched her leave, his mind already spinning. There was more to Miss Davenport's words than met the eye. She had said enough to confirm his suspicions. The portrait was not simply a painting. It was a key, a clue, a symbol of something much darker and much more dangerous. But what could it all mean? As Poirot returned his attention to the painting, he noticed something else, something that had been hidden in plain sight. A faint reflection on the surface of the canvas. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the reflection more closely. It was a figure, an outline, barely visible, but unmistakable. A shadowy shape, just behind the frame. Poirot's heart quickened as the implications of the reflection sank in. It was a person, and they were standing just outside the frame, watching him. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was one crucial question that still loomed large in Poirot's mind. Who was the man in the portrait, and why was he so significant? As he turned to leave the room, Poirot felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. The answers were out there, hidden somewhere in the house, buried beneath layers of deception and misdirection. and Poirot was determined to uncover them all, no matter where they led. The game, he knew, was far from over. Chapter 6. The following morning, the mood in Carrington House was somber, with the events of the previous night hanging heavy in the air. Colonel Hawthorne's body had been removed, and the authorities had begun their investigation. The guests, though shaken, had returned to their rooms to recover, though it was clear that the death had stirred something much deeper within them. It was no longer just a mystery surrounding a strange portrait. It had become a matter of life and death. Poirot, as always, remained calm amidst the chaos. His mind was like a well-oiled machine, each piece of the puzzle falling into place with a quiet efficiency. He had spent the morning revisiting the scene of the crime, questioning the staff, and piecing together the fragmented details of Colonel Hawthorne's last moments. But there was still something that didn't quite add up. The Colonel's death, though clearly planned, was only one part of the story. The portrait, the gentleman in the portrait, was at the center of it all. But why? What was it about the painting that had caused so much fear and tension? Poirot's sharp mind had already discerned that the truth was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The guests were hiding something. Lady Carrington, Sir Reginald, Miss Davenport, and even the Colonel himself. They all had their secrets, and it was up to Poirot to untangle the web they had woven. At last, Poirot knew it was time. The final pieces were in place, and it was time to confront them all. He called for a gathering in the grand drawing room, where the portrait still hung in the corner, its gaze ever watchful. One by one, the guests entered the room, their faces etched with uncertainty. Lady Carrington was first, her expression a mixture of anxiety and hope. Sir Reginald followed closely behind, his usual air of arrogance subdued. Miss Davenport entered last, her composure unchanged, but her eyes flickered briefly to Poirot before she took her place. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension that radiated from the gathered guests. He studied each of them carefully, his mind working silently as he prepared to reveal the truth. "Mon cher friends," Poirot began, his voice steady and commanding, "I have spent many hours that you are all well aware of, examining the events that have unfolded here at Carrington House. There has been death. There has been deception. But most of all, there has been fear." Lady Carrington's lips trembled, but she remained silent, her hands clasped tightly together. Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flicking around the room. Miss Davenport, as always, was composed, her posture perfect, though her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Poirot continued, "But fear, my friends, is not the cause of these events. No, fear is the result. The cause, the true cause, lies in a painting, a portrait that was brought into this house not by chance, but by design. The gentleman in the portrait." He turned slowly to face the painting, his gaze unwavering. "This painting, which you all believed was nothing more than a mere piece of art, has been the catalyst for everything that has transpired. It is not merely a representation of a man. It is a symbol of death, of betrayal, and of a family's dark secret." The room fell silent as Poirot's words sank in. Lady Carrington's face turned pale, and Sir Reginald's hand instinctively moved to the pocket of his coat, as though searching for something, perhaps reassurance. Miss Davenport, however, remained still, her expression unreadable. Poirot turned back to the group, his eyes scanning each of them. "But before I reveal the truth about the portrait, I must first tell you this. Each one of you has been involved in this mystery. Each one of you has played a role, whether knowingly or unknowingly." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And now, it is time for the truth to come to light." Poirot's voice dropped to a more intimate tone. "Lady Carrington, I have learned much about you during this investigation. You may have thought you were protecting your family's name, but the truth is, you were hiding something far more sinister. You knew the portrait's history, didn't you? You knew it was connected to your late husband's dealings, and you knew the danger it posed. But you chose to ignore it. You thought that purchasing it would secure your place in society, that it would elevate you above the others. But instead, it brought death. Lady Carrington's face crumpled, and for the first time, she allowed herself to break down. Her hands trembled as she wiped away a tear, her voice barely audible. It's true, Monsieur Poirot. The painting, it belonged to my husband. He had dealings with the artist, dark dealings. The man in the portrait, he was no ordinary person. He was an accomplice of my husband's in a terrible scheme, one that I thought would be forgotten. But I was wrong. Poirot's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He turned his attention to Sir Reginald. And you, Sir Reginald, he said. You, who pretended to be indifferent to the painting, but in reality, you had a much deeper connection to it. You knew its origins, far more than you were willing to admit. You were a part of the same dark web that Lady Carrington had tried to bury. You were in Venice when the painting was first discovered, weren't you? You knew exactly what it represented. Sir Reginald shifted uneasily in his chair. I did know, he admitted, his voice strained. But I never wanted to be involved in it. I was a fool, yes, but I never intended for anyone to die. I only thought of the painting as a valuable piece of art, a commodity. I never imagined the danger it posed. Poirot nodded, acknowledging the confession, but his eyes remained focused on Miss Davenport. And you, mademoiselle, he said. You have been the most elusive of all. But your connection to this mystery is undeniable. You were not just a visitor here, were you? You were the key to unlocking the truth. The painting, it was you who knew the true identity of the man in it. Miss Davenport's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. Poirot continued, the man in the portrait was not simply an accomplice of Lady Carrington's late husband. He was her husband, the very same man who had been involved in the scandalous dealings. The artist, you see, had painted him as a reminder, a mark of the family's dark past. But it was not just a relic. It was a threat. And when the colonel began to uncover these secrets, he paid the price with his life. The room was still, save for the sound of Lady Carrington's stifled sobs. Miss Davenport finally spoke, her voice cold but resigned. It was meant to stay buried, she said quietly. But the colonel was too close to the truth. We couldn't allow it to be exposed. Poirot nodded, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. And so, the colonel's death was no accident. It was an act of desperation, to cover up the past. With that, Poirot turned to the guests once more. Now you know the truth. The painting was not just a work of art. It was a testament to a family's corruption. And now, justice will be served. Lady Carrington and Sir Reginald sat in stunned silence, their faces pale and shaken. Miss Davenport stood motionless, her eyes downcast. The web of lies had been unraveled, the secrets exposed, and the truth had finally come to light. Poirot stood tall, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a case well solved. The case is closed, Miss Amos, he said softly, and the painting will no longer hold sway over this house. The truth is far more powerful. As the guests began to leave the room, Poirot's gaze lingered on the portrait one last time. He had solved the mystery, but the man in the painting would remain forever frozen in time, his secrets now exposed to the light of day. With a final glance at the portrait, Poirot turned and left the room, his work done. The mystery had been solved, and justice had been served. Chapter 7. The guests had been dismissed, and the house, once again, fell into a heavy silence. The authorities had taken their statements, the scene of the crime thoroughly examined. Colonel Hawthorne's death, though tragic, had been revealed to be part of a larger conspiracy, one that stretched back through the years, entwining the fates of everyone in the house. The servants had cleared away the remnants of the previous evening's chaos, and the portrait still hung on the wall, its quiet gaze seemingly unchanged. Yet, to Hercule Poirot, it had become a symbol of the intricate dance of deception he had unraveled. As the house emptied, Poirot stood alone before the portrait once more. He took a step back, his sharp eyes scanning every detail of the painted face. The man in the portrait no longer held the same air of mystery, now that the truth had been revealed. But still, there was something unsettling about the eyes. Even after all that had transpired, Poirot could not help but feel that there was a final twist to the story, something that lingered just beyond his reach. It was then that a soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lady Carrington entered, her face still pale from the revelations. She was dressed in black, her mourning attire fitting her grief, though her eyes were red from hours of crying. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice weak but determined, "I wanted to thank you for uncovering the truth. But there is something that I still do not understand." Poirot turned, his gaze steady but kind. "Madam, you need not thank me. It was my duty to uncover what had been hidden. But you are right to seek answers, for the full truth is not yet completely revealed." Lady Carrington's eyes widened, her face falling in confusion. "What do you mean? You have solved the mystery. We know who was responsible for the Colonel's death, for the dealings in Venice, for the painting's origins. What more is there?" Poirot smiled faintly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Ah, madam, the solution is always more complicated than it seems. Sometimes, we uncover a truth only to realize that it leads us to a deeper mystery. What you see before you," he gestured toward the portrait, "is not just a record of the past. It is also a symbol of the power of secrets and the way they shape our lives. And while the Colonel's death was indeed tragic, I have a feeling there is one last thing that no one has truly grasped yet." Lady Carrington stepped forward, her brow furrowed. "But what is it? What else could there be?" Poirot moved closer to the portrait, his eyes narrowing as he studied the details with renewed focus. "Do you recall the inscription on the bottom of the painting, madam?" he asked softly. She nodded slowly. "Yes, El uomo che non muore mai. The man who never dies. What does it mean, Poirot? Why would someone write such a thing?" Poirot paused, allowing the tension in the room to build. "It means more than you know. It means that the man in the portrait, your husband, was not merely a victim of circumstance. He was a man who had chosen to bury the past, to erase the mistakes he made. But in doing so, he inadvertently gave birth to a new kind of power, a power that outlived him. The painting itself, Madame Carrington, is not just a painting. It is an icon, a symbol of immortality in the minds of those who knew him." Lady Carrington's eyes widened, and for the first time, her grief seemed to shift to something darker. "You mean, the portrait holds some kind of curse?" Poirot shook his head, his expression calm. "No, madam, not a curse, but a power of perception. The man in the portrait was never meant to be forgotten. His image, his actions, they linger in the minds of those who saw him. Even now, his presence is felt in this house, in this mystery." The silence in the room was thick. Lady Carrington struggled to comprehend what Poirot was suggesting. She had known her late husband to be a man of influence and power, but the idea that his legacy would persist through a mere painting, something so tangible, yet so intangible, was a concept that seemed almost impossible to grasp. "But Poirot," she asked, her voice trembling, "what does this mean for us? For the people who are still alive? The guilt, the shame, does it never end?" Poirot turned to face her fully, his gaze steady and compassionate. "No, madam, the guilt does not end. But it does not need to destroy you. The truth has been revealed. Justice has been served. The portrait has no more hold over you. It is only the power of the mind, your mind, that will decide how you move forward." Lady Carrington's shoulders slumped, as if a weight had been lifted, though the sorrow in her eyes remained. She walked slowly to the window, staring out at the rolling countryside beyond the estate. The wind stirred the branches of the trees outside, but within, the house was still. The story had come to its conclusion. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, turning back to him. "You have given me something I did not think I would ever find. A sense of closure. A sense that I can move on, despite everything." Poirot smiled gently, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. "Madam, it is not I who have given you this closure. It is you, yourself. The truth is always within us. We only need the courage to face it." Lady Carrington nodded slowly, as if absorbing the weight of his words. She took a deep breath, standing straighter now. "I will deal with it," she said firmly. "I will move on." Poirot nodded, satisfied with her resolve. "I believe you will, madam. And now, the time has come for me to take my leave." As Poirot turned to leave the room, he paused briefly, his eyes lingering on the portrait one last time. The man in the painting, the man who never dies, would remain immortal in the minds of those who had known him, but the house would no longer be consumed by his shadow. The truth had been revealed. Justice had been done. With a final glance at Lady Carrington, Poirot stepped out of the room, leaving behind the mysteries of the portrait and the house. The case had been solved, but Poirot knew that the echoes of this story would reverberate for years to come, in ways both seen and unseen. As he walked down the grand hallway of Carrington House, Poirot's mind wandered briefly to the complexities of human nature, the desire to escape the past, the need to protect our darkest secrets, and the inevitable consequences of those actions. But that, Poirot thought with a quiet smile, is the true essence of the human condition. The game, as always, is never truly over. And with that, he left the house, his mission complete, the mystery solved, and the portrait's legacy finally put to rest. Chapter 8. Carrington House, once full of whispers and tension, now lay quiet in the wake of Hercule Poirot's investigation. The mystery that had gripped the estate, involving the enigmatic portrait, the tragic death of Colonel Hawthorne, and the tangled webs of deceit woven by Lady Carrington, Sir Reginald, and Miss Davenport, was finally resolved. Yet, in the aftermath, the silence seemed almost oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final resolution. Poirot, having uncovered every last secret and forced the truth into the light, now prepared to depart. His work, as always, had been meticulous, precise, and thorough. Yet, despite the resolution, there was an undercurrent of sadness in the air, a reminder that even in the pursuit of justice, there are no true winners when lives are destroyed. Lady Carrington had accepted the truth with a kind of quiet resignation. Her sorrow, though deep, seemed to have taken on a form of clarity. The past, with all its tangled secrets, had been laid bare before her, and she now understood that there was no escaping it. She would need to face the consequences of her late husband's actions, the ramifications of the portrait, and the choices she had made in seeking to protect a legacy of darkness. Her grief, though still present, had been tempered by a new sense of purpose. The guilt, the shame, which had once seemed insurmountable, had been acknowledged and shared with Poirot. Now, as he prepared to leave, she stood in the doorway of the grand drawing room, watching him with a mixture of gratitude and melancholy. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "You have given me more than I could have hoped for. The truth, yes, but also a path forward. I can now leave this place behind and begin anew." Poirot smiled, his gaze kind but firm. "Madam, it is not I who have given you the path forward. It is you, and your own courage, that will lead you from this moment. The truth, once uncovered, must always be faced. It is the only way to find peace." Lady Carrington nodded, her expression one of quiet resolve. "I will try, Monsieur Poirot. I will try." With that, Poirot turned and made his way toward the door. As he passed Sir Reginald, who stood nearby, his face still pale from the shock of the revelations, Poirot gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Sir Reginald met his gaze but said nothing. The man, once so eager to distance himself from the mystery, now seemed a hollow shell, his pride stripped away by the weight of his own involvement in the crime. "You may not have intended harm, Sir Reginald," Poirot said, his tone calm yet piercing. "But in the end, you must take responsibility for your actions. The past can never truly be outrun, no matter how fast one tries to run." Sir Reginald's lips tightened, but he did not respond. His eyes betrayed the regret he could not bring himself to voice. Poirot finally turned to Miss Davenport, whose cool composure had remained unshaken throughout the investigation. She stood by the fireplace, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames, her expression unreadable. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice gentle but firm, "you have played a key role in this mystery. And though you may have believed that your actions were justified, you must now understand that you, too, have a part to play in the resolution of this story. It is never too late to seek redemption." Miss Davenport looked up, her eyes meeting Poirot's for the first time in several days. There was no defiance in her gaze now, only the faintest hint of sorrow. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I was trapped by my own choices. I thought that protecting my family's name, protecting the Carrington legacy, was the right thing to do. But it was wrong. I see that now." Poirot gave a small nod. "The truth always comes to light, Mademoiselle Davenport. It is a powerful force, even more so than the desire to protect a name." With that, Miss Davenport stepped back, and Poirot, satisfied that his work was complete, made his way to the door. He turned back one last time to survey the room that had borne witness to so many secrets, so much pain, and so much deception. The portrait still hung on the wall, its gaze ever watchful. But now, there was no mystery left to uncover. The portrait no longer had the power it once held over the house. As Poirot walked down the long corridor toward the exit, he could hear the faint sounds of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Lady Carrington following him, her steps hesitant but determined. "Monsieur Poirot," she called softly, "one last question, if you would." Poirot paused, turning to face her. "Of course, madam. What is it?" She hesitated, her gaze distant. "What will become of the portrait?" "The gentleman in the portrait? It is still here. Should it remain? Should I let it go?" Poirot's gaze softened as he regarded the painting. "That is a decision only you can make, Madame Carrington. But I will say this. The painting, as powerful as it may seem, is just a representation of the past. The past, like all things, must be allowed to fade. It will not serve you to keep it here, where it holds such power over your future. Let it go, and move forward. Let the past remain where it belongs, in the past." Lady Carrington's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she gave a small nod. "I understand," she said quietly. "It will go." With a final glance at Poirot, Lady Carrington turned and walked back toward the drawing room, leaving the detective to continue on his way. Poirot stepped out into the crisp morning air, the sun shining brightly over the estate. He paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the countryside around him. The mystery was solved. Justice had been served. And though the house would never be the same, the truth had set those who remained free. As he walked toward the carriage that would take him back to London, Poirot felt a quiet sense of satisfaction settle over him. It had been a long and difficult case, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. And that, to Poirot, was always the most important thing. "Ah," he said softly to himself, his eyes twinkling with his usual sharp intellect. "The truth, it is a most powerful thing. But sometimes, it requires a little help from Hercule Poirot to be truly revealed." With that, he stepped into the carriage and was driven away, leaving Carrington House behind. The case of the gentleman in the portrait was closed, and Hercule Poirot had once again outwitted the darkness. Chapter 9. The rolling hills of the English countryside stretched out before Hercule Poirot as the carriage sped along the winding path, its wheels kicking up dust as it rolled toward London. The morning sun cast long shadows across the land, its golden rays reflecting off the quiet, serene landscape. Yet, despite the beauty around him, Poirot's mind remained focused on the events of the past few days. The case of the gentleman in the portrait had been resolved, but as always, there was a lingering thought in his mind. The picture of Colonel Hawthorne's tragic death, the complex dynamics between Lady Carrington, Sir Reginald, and Miss Davenport, and the haunting presence of the painting itself. It all danced in the corners of his mind, each piece of the puzzle now neatly fit together, yet leaving him with a sense of unresolved curiosity. For Poirot, there was something deeply satisfying about solving a mystery, yes. But there was also something equally unsettling about the aftermath. The way the truth, once revealed, settled into the world and changed everything. The lives of the people involved would never be the same. They would carry the weight of the past, but would they truly be able to move forward? Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the carriage wheels creaking, and he shifted slightly in his seat. His eyes glanced out the window, where the quaint cottages of the countryside gave way to the sprawling buildings of London in the distance. A new case awaited, he was sure. A new mystery to unravel, new faces to observe, and new truths to uncover. Such was the life of a detective, and for Poirot, it was a life that offered both satisfaction and an endless need for answers. He sighed softly, his mind now returning to the final words of Lady Carrington. She had chosen to remove the portrait from Carrington House. The decision had been a difficult one for her, but she had finally understood that the painting was more than just a reminder of the past. It was a barrier, a weight that prevented her from truly moving forward. Poirot had given her a parting piece of advice: let go of the past. Let it remain in the past, where it belongs. For a woman like Lady Carrington, that was no easy task. She had spent years protecting the legacy of her late husband, clinging to a world that no longer existed. But in the end, the truth had given her the strength to face what she had tried so hard to bury. And then there was Sir Reginald, an arrogant man whose pride had led him into a dangerous game. It was clear that his role in the tragedy was rooted in his own guilt. Yet, as Poirot had observed, Sir Reginald's acknowledgement of his mistakes was not enough to absolve him. Guilt was a heavy burden, but it was one he would have to bear for the rest of his life. Would he change? Would he finally face his true self? Or would he remain trapped in the image of the man he had always pretended to be? Miss Davenport, too, remained on Poirot's mind. The calm, calculating woman who had been so reluctant to reveal the truth, yet whose quiet remorse had ultimately surfaced. She had been just as trapped as the others, though in her case, it was her own sense of duty to her family and their legacy that had led her astray. She had made a a choice to protect her family's reputation at all costs. But in the end, that choice had led to the destruction of everything she had hoped to preserve. As the carriage drew nearer to London, Poirot allowed himself a moment of reflection. His work was done in Carrington House, but there would always be another mystery, another case. It was the way of his world. The carriage pulled up in front of his apartment in London, the familiar street stretching out before him. Poirot stepped out of the carriage, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He had a few days to rest, a rare luxury for someone like him. But even as he entered the building and made his way up the staircase, his thoughts returned to the case he had just solved. The gentleman in the portrait had been no ordinary case. It had been a study of human nature, the lies we tell ourselves, the things we do to protect our image, and the terrible consequences of living in the shadow of our own guilt. The portrait had been more than a mere object. It had been a manifestation of the sins and regrets that haunted those who had once been part of the Carrington family's world. Poirot paused as he reached his door, a small smile playing on his lips. Yes, it had been a complicated case, but in the end, the truth had triumphed. The portrait was gone. The guilt had been acknowledged. The past, for better or worse, had been confronted. As he entered his apartment and settled into his chair, Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, letting the calmness of the quiet room wash over him. His work was done, but he knew that the next case would be waiting for him soon enough. There was no rest for the determined detective, no respite from the endless search for truth. And so, with a sigh, Poirot allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. He knew that the journey of discovery would continue. The world was full of mysteries, and Poirot was always ready to unravel them, one by one. For Hercule Poirot, the truth was everything. And as long as there were secrets to uncover, he would remain steadfast in his quest, his little grey cells never tiring, never faltering in their pursuit of the one thing that mattered most, the truth. And with that thought, Poirot settled back into his chair, content in the knowledge that the case of the gentleman in the portrait had been solved. Justice had been served, and the world was a little bit closer to being set right. Chapter 10. The following weeks passed quietly, as Poirot relished the rare peace that had descended upon his life. London, always bustling with life and activity, seemed to full in the winter months, the streets blanketed by an early frost. Poirot found himself spending more time in his apartment, revisiting old cases and perusing new letters, but for the first time in many months, his mind was not consumed by a new mystery. He spent his days reading, walking through the crisp London streets, and reflecting on the gentleman in the portrait case, but the quiet only lasted so long. Deep within, Poirot knew it was never truly over, not just the case, but the way it had lingered with him. The unraveling of the Carrington family's tragic past had been, in a sense, a resolution, but it was also an eerie reminder of how deeply secrets could poison the present. One late afternoon, as Poirot sat in his study, sipping his usual cup of tea, a knock sounded at the door. He glanced up, surprised by the interruption. It was a rare visitor at this time of day, and Poirot's curiosity was piqued. His mind immediately went into analytical mode. Who would seek him out now, when everything seemed settled? Poirot opened the door to reveal a familiar face, one he had not expected to see again. It was Lady Carrington, her eyes tired but determined, her face slightly drawn from the weight of recent events. She stood in the doorway, hesitating for just a moment before speaking. "Good evening, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly. "May I come in?" Poirot stepped aside, allowing her entry. "Of course, madam. It is rare for one to visit so soon after such a case has concluded. Please, make yourself comfortable." She nodded, sitting at the small table in his study, her hands folding neatly in her lap. Poirot studied her quietly, waiting for her to speak. He had not expected her to visit, especially after the resolution of her husband's and the Colonel's tragic involvement in the portrait's curse. "I've come to thank you again," Lady Carrington said quietly, her voice tinged with an emotion Poirot could not quite read. "But also, to ask for something more. Something I had not anticipated needing to ask." Poirot's sharp eyes never left her face. He could sense a certain hesitancy in her demeanor, a tension that hinted at something she had yet to express. "You are welcome, madam," Poirot replied, settling into his chair. "But I sense that you are not here solely to thank me. What is it that troubles you now?" She sighed deeply, the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing on her. "I know that the past has been laid bare, that I have made my peace with what happened in Carrington House," she began slowly. "But, Poirot, there is something about it all that I cannot shake. I thought I had confronted it, but I fear I have not. There are still echoes of that past. They haunt me, not just as memories, but as unanswered questions." Poirot remained silent, watching her carefully. He could tell this was no simple matter of closure. She was seeking something more, something that had yet to be resolved in her own heart. "You wish to know more," Poirot said softly. "More about the portrait, perhaps? Or about the man who was once so central to your life, your husband?" Lady Carrington's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she nodded. "Yes. I've asked myself questions that have never been answered. And now, even with the truth about the portrait and Colonel Hawthorne's death, I wonder, was it all necessary? Was there more I could have done?" Poirot stood up and walked toward the window, his back turned to her as he reflected on her words. "Madam," he said slowly, "the truth is a powerful thing. But sometimes, we are left to wrestle with it even after it has been uncovered. There is no easy answer to what you ask. The past, it is never simple." Lady Carrington's face softened, and she rose from her seat. She walked over to the window, standing beside Poirot, gazing out into the London streets below. The city had a distant, cold beauty in the winter months, its grey skies a perfect reflection of her mood. "Could I have prevented it all?" she asked softly. "Could I have stopped my husband's actions before they led to such darkness?" Poirot turned to her, his voice gentle yet firm. "You cannot change the past, madam. But you have done what you can. The truth has been uncovered, and those who are guilty have been held accountable. What happened to your husband, the choices he made, were his alone. You cannot bear that burden for him." Lady Carrington lowered her eyes, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her own reflection. "But I still carry it, Poirot. The knowledge that my husband was involved in such a twisted web, that I could have known, or should have known sooner. His actions have tainted everything I have tried to build since. The guilt, it stays with me." Poirot's eyes softened. "Guilt is a shadow that follows us all, madam. But there is one thing you must understand. The past is never fully in our control. What we can control is how we respond to it, how we move forward. The portrait, your husband's secrets, the Colonel's death, it all belongs to a time that is now behind you. You must let it go." Lady Carrington stood silently for a moment before nodding slowly, as if accepting Poirot's words. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The tension in her shoulders seemed to ease, but her face still held the remnants of sadness, of regret. "You are right, Poirot," she said softly. "The truth is out. I must move on." Poirot gave a small smile. "That is all any of us can do, madam. We cannot undo the past, but we can ensure that it does not define our future." As Lady Carrington turned to leave, she paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "thank you. I know you did not just uncover the truth for me. You did it for all of us. The truth, as you said, is a powerful thing. and I am finally ready to face it, to leave it behind." Poirot nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You are most welcome, madam. Go now, and live the life that lies before you. That is the best way to honor the past, to live fully in the present." With that, Lady Carrington left the room, the echoes of the past slowly fading behind her. Poirot watched her go, knowing that while the case of the gentleman in the portrait had come to an end, the personal journey for those involved had just begun. For Hercule Poirot, it was yet another reminder that the greatest mysteries were not those we solved, but the ones that remained within the human heart. The truth, after all, was not just about facts and evidence. It was about the courage to face ourselves and the strength to move beyond our past. And so, with a final glance at the portrait that had once haunted the Carrington family, Poirot turned away, knowing that there would always be more mysteries waiting for him. But for now, he could rest, knowing he had once again set things right. Weeks had passed since Lady Carrington's visit, and while Poirot's days had settled into a quiet rhythm once again, the echoes of the Carrington case lingered in his mind. The portrait, the death of Colonel Hawthorne, the secrets of the Carrington family, they had all been resolved. Yet the complexities of the human soul, the tangled web of guilt, grief, and redemption, continued to occupy his thoughts. The truth had been uncovered, yes, but the emotional aftermath was something that even Poirot could not easily unravel. It was a chilly afternoon when a letter arrived at Poirot's doorstep. It was neatly addressed, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, with a hint of haste. As Poirot read the envelope, he could already feel a sense of anticipation rising within him. The address was from the countryside, near Carrington House. The sender was none other than Miss Eliza Davenport, the quiet but intense woman who had played a key role in the case. Curiosity piqued, Poirot opened the letter with care. Inside, the paper was crisp, the words flowing with a sense of urgency. "Dear Monsieur Poirot, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I am writing to you, as I find myself still troubled by the events that unfolded at Carrington House, particularly by the portrait and the tragic deaths that were connected to it. There is something I feel I must confess, something I have carried within me that I can no longer leave unspoken. It is not just the guilt of my family's actions that I struggle with, but something far more personal, something that involves you, Monsieur Poirot. I beg of you, if you have the time, to come once more to Carrington House. I have something that needs to be said. Yours sincerely, Miss Eliza Davenport." Poirot's brow furrowed as he read the letter. Miss Davenport had always seemed composed, even distant, in their previous interactions. What could she possibly need to confess that had been left unsaid all this time? He had assumed that the case was complete, that all the truths had been laid bare. But it seemed there was more to this story, something still hidden beneath the surface. The detective wasted no time. Within the hour, he had arranged a carriage and made his way back to Carrington House, where the shadows of the past still lingered. As he arrived at the familiar estate, Poirot could not help but notice how different the house appeared in the light of day. The dark and oppressive air that had once permeated the halls was now replaced by a quiet stillness, as if the house itself was recovering from its tumultuous past. Yet, as Poirot approached the door, he sensed that Miss Davenport's request was not one that could be ignored. There was something more, something that needed to be addressed. Miss Davenport was waiting for him in the drawing room. She stood by the window, her back turned as she gazed out at the garden. Her posture was straight, but there was a tension in her shoulders that had not been present before. She did not turn when Poirot entered, but he could tell that her mind was racing with whatever it was she had yet to reveal. "Mademoiselle Davenport," Poirot said, his voice breaking the silence. "I have come, as you requested." She turned to face him, her eyes now shadowed with something deeper than mere regret. There was a heaviness to her presence, as though she had been carrying this burden for far too long. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, her voice betraying a note of vulnerability that Poirot had never heard from her before. "I know this is unexpected, but I could not bear to leave things as they were." Poirot gave a small nod, stepping closer to her. "What is it that troubles you, mademoiselle? You have already revealed much of the truth. Is there something left unspoken, something that you fear might remain hidden?" Miss Davenport's eyes flickered for a moment, as though contemplating whether or not to continue. She sighed deeply, as though gathering the courage to speak. "I never told you everything, Poirot," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "There is something I have kept from you, something that, until now, I believed was best left buried. But I cannot move forward until I speak of it." Poirot did not interrupt, allowing her the space to speak her truth. He could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, the weight of her confession pressing down on her. I was not just an innocent bystander in all of this. I had a deeper connection to the portrait and to the events that transpired. You see, Poirot, I was in love with my uncle, Colonel Hawthorne," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. Poirot's eyes widened, but he said nothing. He had never expected such a revelation. Miss Davenport's connection to the Colonel had been one of the most enigmatic aspects of the case. To hear her speak of it now, with such candor, was both unexpected and illuminating. In the years before the portrait came to Carrington House, Miss Davenport continued, the Colonel and I were involved. He was a man of power, of influence, and for a time, I thought he could offer me the world. But he was also a man consumed by his own desires, his ambition, his need to control everything around him. It was his influence that led me to do things I now regret. I believed that I could escape my family's legacy, that I could escape the guilt of our actions, by being with him. Poirot listened intently, his mind processing the revelation. "And the portrait?" he asked softly. "How does it fit into all of this?" Miss Davenport's face clouded with emotion. "The portrait, it was not merely a symbol of the past, as you initially believed. It was a reminder of my own role in the events that led to the Colonel's death. I was complicit, Poirot. I knew of his dealings, his connections to the Carrington family's dark past. And yet, I chose to stay silent. I chose to protect him, even when I knew it would ultimately destroy everything." Her confession hung in the air, the weight of it settling heavily between them. Poirot remained silent for a moment, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in. "You have carried this burden for far too long," Poirot said gently, his voice full of understanding. "And now, mademoiselle, you must decide how to move forward. The truth is out, and you have taken the first step toward facing your past." Miss Davenport nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and relief. "I know, Monsieur Poirot. I can no longer live in the shadow of that truth. It has been too long, and I am tired of running from it." Poirot stepped toward her, his eyes softening. "Then, mademoiselle, you must let it go. Release the weight of your guilt, and allow yourself the chance to heal. The past is behind you now." She nodded again, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you, Poirot," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for helping me find my way out of this darkness." Poirot smiled, a rare warmth in his eyes. "It was never just about solving the case, mademoiselle. It was about understanding the human heart, the choices we make, and the consequences we must face. And now, you have taken the hardest step of all." With that, Miss Davenport stood tall, her posture more resolute than it had ever been before. The weight of the past no longer seemed to burden her as it once had. The road ahead would not be easy, but she had begun her journey toward redemption. As Poirot left Carrington House once more, the final chapter of The Gentleman in the Portrait case had been written. The portrait itself had been removed, and its legacy was no longer a shadow over the lives of those who had been caught in its web. But Poirot knew that the true victory had not been in solving the mystery, but in helping those involved find peace with their own souls. And as he stepped into the carriage, heading back toward London, Poirot allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. Thanks so much for joining me on this mysterious journey today. I hope you enjoyed unraveling the twists and turns with me. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you're new, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an eerie tale. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let's keep the mystery alive. Until next time, keep wondering, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep enjoying the mysteries that lie in the moonlight. See you in the next one.